If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit thedihedral.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on! Roll! Hi everyone, this is Clara, welcoming you to another episode of the Dihedral Podcast. Today we are joined by one of the great historians of our time. Dr. Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her specialization is U.S. intellectual and cultural history with research and teaching interests, including the history of philosophy, political and social theory, religion, literature, and the visual arts, the transatlantic flow of intellectual and cultural movements, print culture, and cultural studies. She has several papers and books to her name, including her 2021 book, American Intellectual History from A Very Short Introduction series, her 2019 release of the acclaimed The Ideas That Made America, A Brief History, and the topic of today's discussion, the award-winning 2012 book, American Nietzsche, A History of an Icon and His Ideas. Jennifer, we're so excited to talk to you today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Karen. I'm really happy to be here.
So, regarding the American Nietzsche, the amount of research you must have put into this book, it must have been absolutely immense. And I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about your inspiration, preparation, and process.
Somehow I feel like I want to keep my effort, be modest as I talk about the effort involved, because I think about you and your listeners and what effort you all put in for your great outdoor explorations. And I think whatever I did to pull this book off was like nothing, is like peanuts in comparison. And I mean that very sincerely. So the preparation from the book, I mean, what I would say is I was sort of propelled backwards into this project rather than walking with some intention or deliberateness forward into the project. And that is, and I can explain this, that I am an American historian.
Okay.
I was getting, this is many moons ago, getting my PhD in American history. And I was focusing on intellectual history, which is the history of ideas. So not unlike what you do, Carrot, as philosophy, but I'm looking at it in a historical perspective. And so keyword here is American. Mm-hmm. And so I'm supposed to be doing American history. But I had this secret, private little fascination with Friedrich Nietzsche, but I had to keep it on the down. It turns out, well, of course, I'm not the only one. I had to keep it on the down low because Nietzsche was German, not American. So, the problem for me is the thinker that most captured my imagination was not American, and yet I was tasked to write, a dissertation, what ultimately became this book on American history. And so I worked to kind of, I basically worked to try to get away from Nietzsche.
Yeah, of course.
And, how can I get away from him? And the funny thing that happened in that process, Carrot, was that I was turning to good American thinkers, and I was starting to see that they had a fascination with Nietzsche. Oh, right. Brilliant. So in my effort to get away from Nietzsche and turn to real American thinkers, it kept bringing me back to Nietzsche. And it was with thinkers that I'd never heard of before, thinkers that are well known to us, ones that are utterly surprising, like what are they doing with Nietzsche? Yeah. And basically that's how this project sort of announced itself to me, that I was not alone in my private fascination with Nietzsche, but that actually so many of the major thinkers, writers, poets, philosophers, artists of the 20th century also had that fascination. Some of them hated him, the fascination was a disgust. It wasn't always, loving and longing, but it was intense. There's never a record of contact with Nietzsche that wasn't intense. And so a project was born. The question was, what is the thought of an anti-democratic, anti-Christian, frankly, anti-enlightenment, like tick off all these things that America, Americans think as part of their identity. So like all of these things, what is this anti-democratic, anti-Christian, anti-enlightenment, anti-feminist, anti-everything doing in a culture like ours? So why Nietzsche? Why from the early 20th century up to the late 21st century into our own day, why have Americans been drawn to a thinker who really had no interest in America? When he wrote about it, didn't have particularly nice things to say about it, right?
Yeah.
And basically hacked away at some of our most central ideas or, notions of self-understanding. And so that curious problem kind of sent me, if I will, like I said, propelled me backwards into this project. But you asked about the process.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of, if you will, the initiating tick or the bomb, I guess I should say, that threw me into this project. And then, once I started looking, it was just crazy how much Nietzsche popped up in popular culture, in high culture, in our art, in our music. And so the question was really not where to find these connections, but how to kind of manage them. And so, I suppose that's a story in itself, but to me, it was just a fascinating process of discovery, and how people from even the same period or the same identity group or the same, political party or religious identity could also have such different relationships to Nietzsche. So that was fascinating to me. Yeah.
It's interesting just hearing that background, and it almost seems like, just to let the listeners know, the amount of details that are included in this book, it's almost what I foresee is maybe you tugging on like a string of a humongous quilt and just watching all these other connections. I can't imagine how many things you had to discover, like newspaper clippings. This wasn't just reading other people's work. I mean, you did some real depth of discovery. How did that go?
Okay, well, yeah. So, maybe I should make generalizations about historians, but there's a phrase called the archive rat. But I do think that there's something pretty common among historians is we love the hunt.
Yeah.
We love the digging. And it's like, we're after sources, because we need evidence. What's going on there? For me, what I love about intellectual history is I'm trying to get records of thought, right? Like I'm trying to get people from the past who are now dead and gone, going on record with what mattered to them. Yeah. To sometimes their deepest thoughts, their deepest longings, their deepest fears. So, right. So that's a different kind of source than other kinds of history, maybe military history or political history, economic history, where you can go to other kinds of sources. What I'm, as an intellectual historian, interested in a way is pretty ephemeral, right? It's like people's inner longings and outward fears. And so in terms of sources, you're right. I just kind of I went everywhere I could go to find any kind of source. So these are published books either about Nietzsche or where he crops up. Articles, sometimes scholarly, but also popular articles in newspapers, popular magazines, journals of opinion. And Nietzsche, as you can see in my book, never goes out of fashion. So it's kind of astonishing. He's like evergreen, he's ever present in whatever the debate is of the day, whether it's World War I or the Depression or World War II, or the suffocating environment of post-war America or the radical 60s. Nietzsche's there, left, right, Democratic president, Republican president, Nietzsche is somehow a touchstone. So finding those kinds of sources actually wasn't, like I said, finding them in archives, in old books and old reading rooms. That was the fun part, kind of. Then just managing it and figuring out what are these documents telling me, that was probably quite a bit more challenging.
Man, it's great. Just imagining you, burning the midnight oil, sometimes literally looking at old newspaper clippings for us to read. It just came together perfectly. And so now that we have a little background, I think it came together perfectly, at least. And now that we have a little background on the book and the process, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about who he was as a person.
Sure. And this is very relevant for the story, which we can touch on in a bit. So Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher, was born in the early 19th century, and lived up until 1900. He died actually in 1900. And Nietzsche was raised in an extremely pious Lutheran household. I mean, he was as good and sweet and dutiful a Christian as ever there was one. Nietzsche went off to it's called Schulpforta, which was a boarding school when he was younger, and because he was so gifted and so smart. And it was when he was 16 years old when he actually first discovered philosophy as a possible profession. And he discovered it by way of reading Ralph Waldo Emerson, which I can come back to later.
Yeah.
Anyway, this sort of puts Nietzsche on his path to becoming a philologist, but then a philologist, and then sort of edging into what we would recognize as philosophy. And then Nietzsche got his PhD, went off and became a professor at a very, very young age. And he wrote his first book, was kind of in some ways his biggest hit during his lifetime, which was The Birth of Tragedy, which was a study of tragedy. And it kind of caused a sensation. It was pretty scandalous at the time. And Nietzsche kind of was catapulted into temporary fame, but then basically pulled back. And Nietzsche eventually, or not shortly thereafter, ended up leaving the academy. He didn't, for many reasons, the academy was a bad fit for him, intellectually, personally. And so Nietzsche then became essentially a freelance intellectual, a freelance philosopher, and went on to write some of the most important books in the history of philosophy. And some of the titles, I'm sure, are familiar to many of your listeners. So Human, All Too Human, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Antichrist. I mean, he wrote many, many books, all books of philosophy. But what he's doing it while he's essentially like an itinerant philosopher with no institutional affiliation, without a big audience. So during Nietzsche's own lifetime, he actually wasn't very well known, at least for the bulk of his lifetime, as a philosopher. And it's really only towards the end of his life that he gets discovered. So Nietzsche, in the last 11 years of his life, he started to have some mental deterioration, had a mental break, and then essentially spent the last decade of his life really crowded, his mind crowded out by madness. I mean, he was really far gone. And sadly, this is the time period when Nietzsche really gets discovered. So it's, as madness is closing in, Nietzsche's works are starting to go out. This is the last decade of the 19th century and starting to get an audience. And by the time Nietzsche died in 1900, he was already breaking into kind of, if you will, world fame. And the American reception, which is the part that I study, is just a tiny part of that larger story about Nietzsche getting, hitting his ideas like wildfire through Europe. In Japan, there's a huge Nietzsche reception. South Asia, I could keep going on and on.
So Nietzsche, when you look on books and posters and things like this, and even just like his philosophy, it almost presents him, if you don't look at any of his background, as like this larger than life figure. He's got this huge mustache and this furrowed brow. At least it's depicted that way a lot, but in reality, his physical stature wasn't anything gigantic, and he spent a lot of his life suffering in a lot of different ways. Can you talk a little bit about how you think like the amount of suffering that he went through and the type of suffering that he went through influenced his writing and his beliefs? Yeah,
that's a great question, and it's actually a question I mean, in some ways, it's one of the key questions for understanding Nietzsche, which is how does the life relate to the thought? And it's one that is picked up again and again in the American reception that I study. So one thing, Carrot, in order to answer that question about the relationship between his life and his suffering and his thought, is maybe I should linger a beat with the thought itself. So, I said Nietzsche started out, discovers philosophy at age 16, ends up becoming a professional academic philologist, breaks from the academy, and then becomes this, very iconoclastic philosopher. And he wrote in many different forms. So he wrote essays. He wrote, Zarathustra is like a prose poem, essentially. And then he's famous for his aphorisms. Yeah. So some of them are literally a sentence long, others are a paragraph long. Nietzsche used to boast that he could put in a sentence what others take a whole book to write, so that, and part of it is Nietzsche's writing is just extraordinary. So the aphorism was what we might say is philosophy by way of lightning strikes. Yeah. But what holds this whole corpus together? So Nietzsche wrote about it, like literally, there's almost not a topic that Nietzsche did not write about, even if it was just one aphorism.
Yeah.
Whether it was about religion or God or nationalism or national diet, or animals, or you name it, he wrote about it.
Yeah.
So it seems like, this guy wrote in all of these different forms. He wrote about just about everything. So what holds the thought together? And again, what I should note is that some Nietzsche scholars insist that things don't hold together, or that, you can break Nietzsche into different periods and he's concerned with a different philosophical problem, but that's somehow separate from the next one. I tend to see a kind of through line between all of Nietzsche's work. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get to the issue about the life because this is kind of crucial. And the through line that I see in his work, and I'm not alone. I think a lot of people see it, but I just wanted to note for your listeners that, there's enough people have very strong opinions about Nietzsche. Not everybody will agree with how I'm characterizing him, and that's what makes him so interesting. But from my vantage point, and certainly from the historical record about how Nietzsche is read, or has been read by many, American readers, there is a through line, and that through line is that Nietzsche believed that there was no universal truth. Yeah, that any claim for a universal, timeless, absolute, transcendental truth was nothing more than a, quote, human, all too human wish, longing for a moral center to our world, wish, longing for something that transcends beyond the here and now. And Nietzsche basically, he called himself a philosopher with a hammer. He came in, and really what holds all these books together is in every single book, he is whacking away at the notion of eternal, timeless, universal truth. He's doing it in different ways, but this was Nietzsche's kind of prime enemy. What that means is he also took down, if he's taking down truth, he was taking down God.
Right.
Yeah. So, Nietzsche is famous for the phrase "God is dead," or the death of God. And this is what makes Nietzsche so scandalous, but also so intriguing and intoxicating, was Nietzsche also believed that God was a fiction. God was something that human beings had created in their own image to give themselves a feeling of something universal, something higher, something outside the self, some meaning beyond all of this earthly meaninglessness. Yeah. And Nietzsche said, it's just not true. There's no there, right. God is just a projection of our fears and our longings and what he called our will to power. And so Nietzsche's philosophy is about both tearing down a notion of a timeless God, as well as a notion of timeless truths. But Nietzsche's philosophy also has an answer to that, which is that Nietzsche said, you can't live among nothing. Mm-hmm. So Nietzsche was not a nihilist. Nietzsche said, we human beings do not live well and thrive among ruins, right? The ruins of dead God, the ruins of old beliefs, the ruins of formally held truths. And so Nietzsche also called for a kind of new philosophy that could go beyond the need for universals, right? That could make meaning without the need for absolute timeless truth. So there's this deconstructive part of Nietzsche, this destructive part of Nietzsche, but there's also this incredibly regenerative part of Nietzsche's philosophy. And sometimes people gravitate towards the one, but they don't like the other.
I agree.
That's fine. But I do think the two go together, right? The part of him that is absolutely just tearing down everything that we hold to be most sacred to give our lives meaning. But also he was a fabulous psychologist, and he understood we as humans don't really do very well without meaning. And so he leaned into that, and so much of his work is trying to imagine how we create meaning beyond meaninglessness. Now, Carrot, I have not forgotten your question, which is how did his life fit in? How did his personal life fit into this? And it fits quite well, because Nietzsche suffered terribly as a human being. He ever since he was little suffered from all sorts of physical ailments. There's been speculation, are some of them psychosomatic, right? Was some of this, caused by a diseased mind? But basically, Nietzsche spent his life at war with his own body. Regular bouts of violent illness, projectile vomiting, terrible migraines. If you ever want to read a description of a migraine that will make you never want to have one, Nietzsche wrote about it. And so Nietzsche suffered on the one hand from a body that was constantly failing him and literally causing him pain. Nietzsche, and this is probably also likely connected to why he ultimately didn't want to hold down a 9-to-5 job.
Right.
So we can say that Nietzsche broke from the academy because intellectually it was too suffocating for him. It was like a gilded cage. Intellectually he needed to be free from the institutional constraints, from the disciplinary boundaries, from the kind of intellectual prissiness that was very common in Germany of his day.
Right.
But it probably also, and that's probably true, and it probably also had something to do was that he was constantly on the search for physical relief, going to what are called cures or retreats, and trying to find better air, better climate, better food for him to muscle through his physical pain. And so what's the relationship to the philosophy? Maybe I'll just try to make this quick, but we can linger if you're interested. And that is, the philosophy, I do think, is a confession of someone who is suffering and trying to give meaning to his suffering.
That's great. That's so well put. Yeah. It's interesting. I talk about this to some students here and there every once in a while. There's certain people, they produce great things. Nietzsche is one of those people, maybe somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, where they suffer through their lives, but they create stuff that's either beautiful or intellectual. And it's one of those things where I feel really bad that anybody would have to go through what he went through. But at the same time, I hate to say happy they went through it, but without that, we wouldn't get to the works on the other side of that. And that seems to be, if I'm hearing you right, the case for Nietzsche. If he wouldn't have gone through some of those immense suffering throughout his life, maybe we don't get like the great works that we have from him today. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, so so this is a problem that many people who've been attracted to Nietzsche have wrestled with. On the one hand, so some have confessed to feeling actually feeling a little guilty. Like almost it's voyeuristic, because
Right.
you read his philosophy and you know something about the life. It does feel voyeuristic. Like there's a pornography of his pain, involved.
Sure.
And for readers who find meaning and inspiration in his writing, there's a kind of pardon my like ickiness to that, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't before I get to those though, let me tell you about the readers who think, aha, this is proof that he was full of it.
Okay. Yeah.
So sorry, I'm giggling. It's not,
Sure.
I giggle when I'm nervous. So what's been interesting to me is how many readers have read Nietzsche's philosophy and found it abhorrent, and then used his personal situation as a way to show that the philosophy was really nothing more than the confession of a sick person, a madman, as a way to delegitimize the philosophy. So one example of that would be, and this doesn't, so when Nietzsche's initially read in 20th century America, one of the biggest group of readers, if you can believe it, well, I guess you can believe it because you read my book, but it's a little bit like, are you sitting down, are actually Christian clergy.
Yeah.
Like his biggest, like part of the reason why Nietzsche becomes a superstar in American life is because Christian clergy in the early 20th century are reading this guy, because they can see that this is what their Christianity is going to be up against in the modern world, right? Like that Nietzsche could be appealing to their parishioners.
Right.
And so for those Christian clergy who find Nietzsche, disgusting, abhorrent, sinful, immoral, you name it. I mean, for crying out loud, he called for the death of God, and said that Christians had his blood on their hands. So no wonder they didn't take kindly to him. For them, Nietzsche's illness, his madness, his suffering was a fabulous morality tale that shows what God does when you have the audacity to question, his legitimacy and authority, right? Yeah. So this is a divine punishment for Nietzsche for trying to pull down, the celestial staircase to God and to heaven and to a hereafter. Yeah. So that's, it's just like one example where the Nietzsche suffering itself, it has a lot of meaning for his readers, but for some, it's a way to basically kind of undermine, the philosophy.
Sure.
If I may linger, let me flip it around. There are others who read it, though, who read it, and who think that this is what, you invoke Edgar Allan Poe. We could probably come up with a lot of thinkers who really, really suffered, whether it was physically, whether it was alcohol and drugs, whether it was psychologically, whether it ended in suicide.
Yeah.
And so, there's a record of genius also of suffering, right? That goes with this kind of genius. And for many, they interpret it as what it takes for a thinker, a writer, a philosopher, a grunge, the lead singer of a grunge band, whatever the case may be, that this is really what they have to pay for. They pay it, they give it, and they give it willingly to have access to what some things that are so foreboding, which is truth, the truth. And for Nietzsche, it was the truth that there was no truth. In other words, they're resistant to, kind of romanticize Nietzsche's suffering, right? Because that would be voyeuristic, it would be pornographic, but they actually see it as a genuine sacrifice that he was willing to take to plumb the depths and basically give us these truths, if you will.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It makes me feel better about thinking about it, at least. I'm really happy that you brought up like the religious thinkers, and I actually had a question about that, not really a question, but it was one of my favorite parts of the book, where there's like a sense of irony in these people who are just like, oh, we have to find a way to like keep people away from him. And as they're doing this, it felt like parents telling their kids, don't watch this movie. And of course the kids are gonna be like, what? Yes, I need to watch it. So that was really eye-opening for me. And just, it went kind of both ways, because I know you talked a little bit about some of these theologians we're just like, oh, Nietzsche was close, and we can use him to push his argument for God by just tweaking a little bit of the language along the way. So there's not really a question in there as much as there is a thank you or a kudos for bringing that to the reader's attention, because I never would have thought about it.
So this is, I mean, this is something that was really fascinating to me, and it kind of like makes me think about other kind of controversies, even the moral controversies of our day. You know, we could talk about those, the intellectual controversies, the main intellectual debates of a moment. That oftentimes it's the naysayers or who are inadvertently, you know, or ironically doing more to create an audience for the thing that they think, you know, that they take as their enemy, by making it seem, you know, so dangerous, so reckless, so, you know, fill in the blank. So something in our own day, which we're seeing in increasing numbers, is banning books. Yeah. Right. So I mean, Nietzsche's part of this history. His books have been banned in America so many times. But you all, I mean, your audience knows there's all sorts of books that are being banned right now. Yeah. And what that does is ironically just make them all the more alluring, you know, precious. What they do is to simply announce how important those books must be, right? That those ideas are so dangerous that were they to get out, you know, all hell could break loose. So that was the case, you know, that was the case that I didn't think I was going to find that, but that was something that just became more and more obvious to me as like all of these clergy, you know, in the 19 teens and 1920s are like fighting over each other to get airtime, you know, get space in magazines and journals as they're giving sermons on Nietzsche. Yeah. That I'm like, that's interesting. What's happening here? You know, what they're doing is really, they really helped create an audience for Nietzsche and helped set the terms for expectation. This guy's powerful. This guy will change your life. Yeah. You know, batten down the hatches. If you know anything and everything that's sacred, you know, do that if you're going to come in contact with this guy. Who wouldn't want to know what's that all about? Yeah. No,
that's great. It's impossible, I guess, to talk about Nietzsche's influence on America without talking about Emerson's influence on Nietzsche. Do you want to talk about that for a little while?
Sure. Okay. Well, I gave a teaser. Yeah, we got the teaser. About 15 minutes ago. And that when I said Nietzsche at age 16 was away at boarding school and discovered philosophy. Well, one of the thinkers who introduced Nietzsche to philosophy was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so Ralph Waldo Emerson, I'm guessing your listeners, it's a name that for some are like, oh yeah, Emerson, you know, self-reliance, and for others it's like vaguely familiar, like I might have read about. So just briefly, Emerson was a towering 19th century American philosopher based in Concord, Massachusetts, who breaks onto the scene with his first book, Nature, of 1838, where it's a beautiful, basically philosophical love letter to nature, which I would think would be interesting to your audience.
Yeah, philosophy and climbing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Emerson was himself an ordained Unitarian minister, but he got himself into trouble after writing Nature by going to Harvard and speaking to a bunch of Harvard graduates who were going off to become ministers themselves, that basically your Unitarianism was a false cage, and you know that the God they were worshiping had become sickly and not worthy of belief. So Emerson, you know, basically steps away. He gets kicked out of Harvard. He gave the speech at Harvard and gets kicked off of Harvard's campus for decades because the speech was so scandalous, but it was important for Emerson to become Emerson. So then Emerson goes on to be a freelance philosopher, writer, poet. He's on the Lyceum lecture circuit in the 19th century. It's really not an understatement to say that in the 19th century, Emerson was probably one of the biggest superstars in American life. Yeah. And Emerson wrote philosophy, mostly essays, about trying to take away the divinity from outside the self and to recognize the divinity and the grandeur inside the human self. Emerson wanted to cut away at sort of the sickly falsehood of culture. Emerson wanted to get back in touch with nature. Emerson wanted to imagine a God that wasn't like outside the self, but was actually everywhere, and was accessed, just by us being in touch with ourselves and being in touch with the natural world. So Emerson's philosophy is in some ways has very prophetic kind of quality to it. It's a very poetic kind of quality to it. It's very, very lyrical. And it's a philosophy that tries to come into new relationship with the self and the world. And so, I mean, another way of thinking about this is that Emerson is sort of the first American philosopher after the American Revolution. And that Emerson is essentially trying to say we need to break from Europe. We need intellectually, we've had an American Revolution, we've politically broken from Europe, but we haven't intellectually really broken. And so Emerson is trying to find a new voice for this new country, right, in the early 19th century. And for those of you, so the Divinity School address, he's well known for self-reliance. He's well known for where he calls for precisely that. What would it be to not be reliant on something outside the self, but to actually be reliant and to nourish the divinity within the self? So these are some of the themes that Emerson wrote about. Nietzsche. So, and I will just say that Emerson, in sort of our living memory of Emerson is like the typical, the hardy American, the great American individualist, lover of democracy, the lover of the American great outdoors. Emerson is all sweetness and light in our view, right? And so there's something so incongruous about the fact that Emerson actually helped Nietzsche become Nietzsche. So Nietzsche read Emerson in translation when he was 16, and this guy blew the doors off of his mind.
Yeah.
So it was basically from reading Emerson at age 16, this pious, dutiful, sweet little boy really starts to doubt that there is a God. And Nietzsche actually writes his first philosophical essays. He's writing after reading Emerson and starting to experiment with these Emersonian themes of the divinity within the self, of the falsehood of external culture, of the kind of reverence towards nature and the natural world. This is Nietzsche starting to become Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche basically read Emerson, Nietzsche read Emerson from the age of 16 pretty much up through his entire functioning intellectual life before his breakdown.
Yeah.
And we have records and records of Nietzsche reading Emerson in translation, his marginalia. What did Emerson write that spoke to Nietzsche? How do we see some of those things crop back up in Nietzsche's own philosophy?
Yeah.
And here I just, Kara, want to just emphasize why this is so like, wow, or at least I think it's so wow.
Amazing.
One is the idea that we have this notion of Emerson as all sweetness and light, and Nietzsche's like bad boy Nietzsche, the syphilitic madman, the King Kong, the philosophical King Kong. And so it's so fascinating to upset that, right? And you suddenly, when you read Emerson now, knowing about Nietzsche's love for him, Emerson starts to look pretty darn transgressive.
Right.
Oh, I mean, Emerson starts to look much more dangerous, much more transgressive, much, much edgier, and frankly, quite a bit darker than the reputation is. By contrast, if you know of this connection, you can read in Nietzsche what we think of Emerson, which is something, an intellectual heart, like a sharpness, but a kind of tenderness and longing and deep humanity behind it.
Right.
you can start to see in Nietzsche the regenerative part and not just the destructive part.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, exactly.
And so suddenly, just knowing that there's this linkage, you realize you can see both of these philosophers in a very, very different light. And the other thing I would just say is that Emerson is understood as being sort of like the classic American thinker, blah, 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 blah. And then Nietzsche is the classic German thinker, classic Teutonic thinker. Well, what happens to these stereotypes about what's American and what's German? Yeah, what's us, what's them, what's European, what's, what's Texan, right?
Yeah, right.
When you start to see two thinkers who are supposed to be so emblematic of different traditions, and the fact that when you read them in tandem, side by side, sequentially, what have you, they look an awful lot alike.
That's so cool.
It makes you also interrogate these assumptions that we make about what it means to be American or what it means to be German or fill in the blank.
That's so awesome.